Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am here today with Zohran Mamdani. He is a representative for the 36th District in the New York State Assembly, and he is currently running for mayor of New York City. Zohran Mamdani, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now listen, I'm not from New York. I've spent about a week in New York in my entire life. It's an overwhelming place. It's a very complex place. It's a fascinating place. You know it. You're from there. You get it in a way that I don't. So I want you to explain to me your current mayor. Now you're running to succeed your current mayor. What's with that guy? How did that happen? He seems very strange.
He's, I probably wouldn't put the word succeed with Mayor Adams in the same sentence. Okay. What the record has been over the last few years. He is someone who, when he ran, he promised that he would be fighting for the working class of New York City, but in office, he has used almost every opportunity to exacerbate the cost of living crisis that is pushing those very working New Yorkers out of the city that they call home.
And how's he doing that?
Well, I think, it's as the mayor of New York City, there are a number of powers that come with that office. One of them is that you set the rent for rent-stabilized tenants across New York City. We have about 8.3 million people who call this city home. About 2.5 of them live in rent-stabilized units. The mayor sets their rent through something called the Rent Guidelines Board. Okay. Under the previous mayor, we saw a number of rent freezes that occurred a few times where tenants understood that their rent this year would be the same as their rent next year because of just how immense the economic pressures they were facing outside of that home. And yet under this mayor that we have right now, Mayor Eric Adams, he's raised the rent 9% in the time since he's been mayor. And those are rates we have not seen since we had a Republican running City Hall. This is just one example, but what I would say is that, almost every time that he's been given an opportunity to intervene to help working class New Yorkers, he's instead poured gasoline on the fire that's consuming them. And I think about when Con Ed, which has a monopoly over many New Yorkers' utility bills, put in an application to the state to raise electricity and gas prices by close to $70 a month, the mayor signed off in support of both of those requests. When, Bill de Blasio created universal pre-K and 3K, this mayor took his opportunity as the mayor of New York City to decimate the 3K program and create an altogether new cost on many New York families of close to $20,000 to $25,000 a year to find replacement childcare.
New York City seems to have not gotten, in many cases, the mayors that it deserves. You've had some bad governance over the years. Yeah. I interviewed recently on this program Jeremiah Moss, the author of Vanishing New York, who talked about the process by which New York City once a place to which all kinds of people could flourish became such an unaffordable place, became a place that caters to billionaires in their little pencil towers, while everyone else struggles. What happened? You've had a series of these mayors. You've had Michael Bloomberg, obviously, was awful. Rudy Giuliani seems like he was pretty awful, even though he's America's mayor. Eric Adams seems both awful and also like he has a screw loose. Why has your city been so poorly served by its governance?
I think part of the reason is that there is also a lot of money to be made in New York City. And a lot of those businesses that benefit from what is an untenable status quo for working people, those same businesses have continued to support candidates that they know will create even greater profit for them. And we see that with Eric Adams. When he was running, it wasn't just that he won the mayor's race. It was that so many national and local figures, both in the media and political classes, designated him as the savior of the Democratic Party.
Looks funny in retrospect. Yeah.
and be the future of this party. But in many ways, he does symbolize the party, but in the sense of its bankruptcy, where this was somebody who was supported by big business by virtue of the fact that he was so open to influence. That wasn't a quirk that they were willing to accept. It was one of the
Mm,
very reasons that they wanted to support him in the first place. And he has made an incredible amount of money for a lot of the people who supported him.
mm.
That we all know about the corruption charges and the fact that he is the first mayor in modern history to be facing federal charges. But what I'm really talking about is this is a mayor who described himself as real estate. And what he has done is gone to bat for real estate and for so many other special interests in the time that he's supposed to be running a city for the benefit of the 8.3 million people who call it home.
Didn't he say he was going to make New York City the crypto capital of America too?
He's said a lot of things. It's quite hard to keep up with everything he's said about New York City, whether it's the Islamabad of America or the crypto capital of the world.
Um. So okay, for New Yorkers, you go out and you talk to New Yorkers, and you hear what they are concerned about. You hear what they love about the city, and you hear what doesn't work about the city. And you hear you have to, as a candidate, you are responsive to their needs, to their aspirations, to their demands. What would you say are the? I mean, I guess the most obvious thing is that it's a very unaffordable city and seems to be becoming worse. But maybe you could elaborate on what you think the most pressing concerns for New Yorkers at the moment are.
I think ultimately it does come back to that question of whether or not they can afford to live the life that they have built in this city. I spent much of last Sunday on Fordham Road in the Bronx and on Hillside Avenue in Queens, two areas that in New York City saw the most staggering shifts towards Trump and even larger drop offs in
Mm.
voting overall in the presidential election. And I asked New Yorkers who lived in those neighborhoods why. Why did they vote for Trump when previously many of them had been voting Democrat? And what I had heard from them is this same issue that they felt they had more money in their pocket 4 years ago, that they couldn't afford groceries, that they couldn't afford their rent. And here, in their words, was a candidate that spoke to their anxiety, spoke to the necessity for a cheaper life, that it would actually be coming about, and promised to bring peace to the world. And we know that those are as insincere claims as they can be coming from someone like Donald Trump. But what he did do is diagnose that despair and offer an answer to it. Whereas many of those voters simply saw a void when it came to what our party is actually offering them. And so when I was concluding those conversations, I asked them, what would it take for you to come back to the Democratic Party?
Mhm.
And I listed out some of the proposals that we launched our campaign with: to freeze the rent, to make buses fast and free, to make universal childcare a reality for all New Yorkers, whether their child is 6 weeks or 5 years of age. And they said it's those very kind of economic issues that would liberate their life as working class New Yorkers from the anxieties that they're currently being consumed by.
What I noticed on your website is that you've got a very simple platform. We did a whole thing on Kamala Harris's policies at Current Affairs, where we did a roundup of her policies. She went from having no policies to having a billion policies, right? 56 policies or something. We analyzed all the policies, but it wasn't easy to remember any of her policies. One of the things that Democrats, I think Hillary Clinton had the same kind of problem, where you give people a whole wonky list of endless little tiny little tweaks you're going to make, and it seems like you've gone and in the opposite direction, in the kind of Bernie Sanders direction of, okay, let's come up with a short, punchy list of things that people will remember. So tell me a little bit more about how you kind of formulated what you see as your core agenda going into this.
I think we worked backwards from what are the costs that dominate working people's lives. And in New York City, the first cost is housing. More than a majority of all New Yorkers hand over greater than 50% of their paycheck each month to a landlord or a bank, with nearly a quarter close behind. And we're seeing that as a reality while evictions surge, homelessness surges, 500,000 of our school children can't afford enough food to eat. And so to me, it was very clear that You should speak to New Yorkers about the crisis they're facing and speak about what are the powers you have as the mayor. And that therefore necessitates a rent freeze, at the very least, for those more than 2 million tenants who live in stabilized housing. And then after housing, the second cost is often childcare. I mean, we are seeing in New York City an economic crisis because the families that leave New York City by virtue of the childcare costs of $20,000 to $25,000 a year, they are taking with them about $2 billion in lost annual revenue. If we don't rectify this situation, we will continue to lose money and lose New Yorkers to a city that they believe will have their dollar go further. And the final issue is transit. I'm as a New Yorker, you use public transit every single day to get to wherever you want to go. And when I've been in the state assembly these last 4 years, I have fought to make buses free, and we won the first ever free bus pilot in New York City history, making one bus in each borough free. And what we saw is that when you do that, you increased ridership by more than 30%. You decreased assaults on bus drivers by 38.9%. And you bring in, of the new riders you bring in, the vast majority are making less than $28,000 a year. And of those new riders, 11% were previously driving their own car or taking a taxi. So you have an economic benefit, a public safety benefit, and an environmental benefit. And so all of those things, while 1/5 of New Yorkers can't afford the bus fare, it makes obvious sense to me.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel for more wonderful current affairs material in the future. And head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine today.
You mentioned, plank one of the Mamdani agenda is capping rent. Obviously, I think there is a pretty much universal consensus that, in the other words of another legendary New Yorker, the rent is too damn high. However, you would get a response every time you talk about rent control, rent freezes. The response that's given by many economists and those who call themselves the YIMBYs is when you impose caps on rent, when you interfere with the signals of the market, as the economists say, you benefit those who benefit from it, those whose rent you have frozen, but you disincentivize the construction of new housing, and ultimately you exacerbate the problem. So how do you plan to make sure that by capping rents for those who you help with your rent cap, you don't you are still able to solve the supply side of the housing problem?
You do that by ensuring that this is not the entirety of your platform.
Mm-hmm.
So we open with this promise to freeze the rent for every rent stabilized tenant, but we still have an entire housing policy platform to put out. And when we lay it out, we will speak about a citywide equitable development project that we have, a proposal that we have to ensure that we are building enough supply that we need so that every New Yorker can have a home, and that we're doing so in a manner that understands it to be a citywide responsibility, as opposed to doing isolated, spot rezonings, which has been what a lot of the current administration's policy has been through much of the last few years. I also think, I'm speaking to you today having come back from a rally to end forced broker fees. New York City and Boston, two of the only cities in America that force tenants to pay brokers' fees for work that is hired and paid for, that should be paid for by the landlord. Mm-hmm. And so often tenants, and I say that as a tenant myself, you may not even meet the broker when you are getting an apartment. It may simply be somebody who tells you online where to go and what code to put in to enter into the apartment. And that is a service, if any is being performed at all, it's a service that is being done to the benefit of the landlord. Mm-hmm. And City Council is going to pass that legislation today. I have legislation at the state level to do the same thing, but it speaks to what are the different ways in which you can actually make housing more affordable and not only freeze the rent, but frankly, bring the rent lower than what it is right now, because that is an ultimate necessity for people to continue to live in New York City.
Now, you've mentioned the ways in which the current the incumbent mayor is the product of exists in office in part because there are wealthy interests who would prefer that someone with his agenda be inhabit that office. someone may ask you then, as I am going to ask you now, look at the record of difficulty that the left has had at attaining power. You are a democratic socialist. How can you possibly, in a city that where the political system is rigged to put someone like Eric Adams or even Michael Bloomberg? My God, someone with no personal charisma but a ton of money. That's the sort of person who's going to get into office. What's your plan? How on earth are you going to succeed in this race?
Well, I would first say that Eric Adams does have charisma, and I think we do have to give that to him.
Oh, Bloomberg, no, though.
Bloomberg,
zero charisma.
But just to say that
Adams
that's not
is fascinating. Just fascinating.
Who win. I think that there are a number of things that give us a pathway to winning, and one of them is the fact that in New York City there's a public matching system. So if you are a New York City resident and you give anywhere between $10 to $250 to a candidate running for mayor, the city will match that 8 times. And so a $250 donation then becomes north of $2,000 in terms of its worth for a campaign. And what that means is if you raise around $1 million, you will then get an additional, about 7 million or so from the city, enabling you to run an $8 million campaign. And I think
that's kind of crazy. That's wild. I mean, that's cool. But that's how did that happen? That's awesome.
The idea of it is to empower small dollar donors. The idea of it is to take on the very kinds of special interests you're talking about. I think it's the kind of thing that would be very difficult to pass today, but I'm glad that it does exist because it means that, for example, so many congresspeople who have stood up for Palestinian human rights have faced multi-million-dollar onslaughts from AIPAC and DMFI and company. And you have to raise raw dollars to compete with that. But when you're running for a citywide office in New York City, you have a pathway to $8 million by only raising $1 million. So I think that is a major way that you can compete. The other thing that I would say is that this is a moment of political uncertainty. This is also a moment of political possibility in that people feel failed by the answers they have been told for many decades. And while there is not a majority of socialist or progressive thinking across New York City, I would say there is a majority who feel left behind by this economic system and the policies of this current administration. And that is an ingredient that could give rise to an entirely new coalition of people who feel left behind and are ready to get behind a leftist in order to turn the page.
Just say it can't hurt that the guy who was supposed to be the great centrist hope for the Democratic Party turns out to be a massively corrupt criminal. Accused, non-convicted, accused.
Allegedly.
I mean, but don't you think? Just to touch on the links with what has just happened at the national level, the massive election that we have just gone through, there is a certain way in which the Democratic establishment has been discredited, that it has, not just through Eric Adams' personal corruption, but through at a national level, the Democratic Party's complete failure to stop the far right. And I think that we're certainly finding, so based on the influx of subscriptions to Current Affairs magazine, that there is all of a sudden a hunger for an alternative message from people who seem like they might have a path out of this.
Yeah, I think that people do see the bankruptcy of leadership at multiple levels of democratic governance across this country. And I think in classic fashion, the political and consultant class is seeking to blame the left for the failures of the center, as if it was a left campaign that we just saw come to an end over these last few months, when in reality, what we saw is a wavering commitment to continuing to have Lena Khan be at the head of the FTC, a desire to campaign with Liz Cheney and Mark Cuban, and a departure from some of the most successful parts of Biden's domestic policy with regards to his economic agenda, all while maintaining the same line for an absolutely horrific and disastrous foreign policy that has continued to fund a genocide that is unabated across Palestine.
Well, speaking of that disastrous foreign policy and that genocide, I mean, you have been an activist for Palestinian rights and against that genocide. Is there anything? I mean, it awkwardly interacts with running for local office, I'm sure, but how have you tried to, is there any way you've been able to deal with that in the New York State legislature? And is there any way anything you can do on issues of foreign policy like that in from the New York mayor's office, other than change whose flag you raise at the endless flag raising ceremonies?
You know, as a state representative, I introduced first in the nation legislation to bar New York charities from funding Israeli war crimes. And I did that because of the fact that on an annual basis, charities registered across this state send tens of millions of dollars to fund the Israeli settler enterprise, a funding scheme that has now grown to include units of the Israeli military that have been found guilty of aiding and abetting that very genocide, or they've been found complicit in it. And you know, that is an example of the kind of legislative action that we have to take, because we know that the horror that we feel in watching this genocide unfold is not simply as witnesses, but also as those who are responsible for it, given our status as Americans as well as New Yorkers. And I think the mayor has an incredible power just by virtue of his bully pulpit. I would argue he has the second largest bully pulpit in America. And he has used that bully pulpit. When he was first running, he said he would retire in the Golden Heights. When he went to Israel, he promised
weird thing to say. Sorry.
Very weird to say. He promised greater cooperation with Israeli settlers and has termed many of the war criminals of the Israeli government to be friends of New York City. And that kind of support from the leader of a city that claims to espouse values that are being ripped up on a daily basis across Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that is something that needs to come to an end.
I'm going to pose as a potential constituent who you meet when you're going door to door, and who is the kind of constituent that makes you go, oh boy, here we go. So you meet a constituent and you say, tell me a little bit about your most serious concerns. And I say, well, I tell you, Mr. Mamdani, I'm really hoping you're going to do something about all of the immigrants that are coming to our city, you know, taking up all the social services and all of the crime in our city. I'm very concerned that all the leftists want to let people out of prison and abolish the police. And I don't want to return to the 1970s, where I was here in the 1970s and you couldn't walk down the street without getting mugged. And then Mayor Giuliani came in and he cleaned all that rubbish, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to go on. How do you speak to a constituent who that tells you that the problem is, as Eric Adams might have told them, the crime and immigration?
I think the first thing you have to do is actually listen to them and not try and dissuade them of what they are feeling, but respond to it. Because too often what the Democratic Party is guilty of is hearing a critique or a concern and then trying to wave it away with a bar graph or a set of statistics. And two concerns around immigration and concerns around disorder, what I would say is what we need to do is to develop new policies as opposed to the ones that have been shown to be failures that have been carried out by the Eric Adams administration. I'd give one example. Right now, what you have is a system where we have street vendors all across New York City. And there is a law that requires the city to give out permits to street vendors, but it is refusing to give out those permits. And what it is doing is requiring street vendors to purchase permits off the black market. And so you have a vendor of a halal cart spending $18,000 just to be able to vend. And because of that black market, because of having to get an illegal, having to get a license from the illegal market, they then have to increase the price of their food from $8 to $10, let's say, because they have to make up that $18,000 cost, which is completely created by Eric Adams' ineptitude. And I think that what you can also talk about is you are going to bring order by giving dignity to people who are trying to make a life for themselves on New York City and taking them out of the shadows. And I think to the question of crime, you have to understand when somebody tells you that, you can ask them, where do you feel this the most? And so often what you will hear is public transit. I feel this when I'm going on the trains or the buses, or I feel this even when I'm at home and I'm thinking about those things. And I think it's important to respond to it by saying two things. The first is one of the reasons I'm fighting for free buses is when we won a free bus pilot, we saw that assaults on bus drivers went down by 38.9%. And that almost identically mirrored what happened in Kansas City when it went down by 39% when they made buses free. And we need to bring safety back to our buses in reality and in perception. This is a clear way that we do so, because every time that a bus driver is assaulted, it is horrific for the worker who is simply doing their job and for the passengers who are just trying to get where they're going. And secondly, I would say that most people, when they're thinking about crime on the subways, they're also just thinking about mental health crises and homelessness. It's not necessarily an act of crime itself. And we are going to be putting out a proposal to create a new Department of Community Safety that would empower a force separate from the police that would be responding to mental health crises, and their responses would be based out of the subway system in many of the commercial units that are now vacant across the subway system, very much inspired by the successes of programs in Philadelphia with Hub for Hope, as well as in the BART system out west. And I think that speaking to these concerns and answering them in a way that is honest to yourself, but also honest to this perception that is sometimes grounded in either anecdotes or reality, and saying, this isn't working what we're doing right now. Here's what we're going to pursue.
Yeah, I like what you do there, because, instead of just saying, I believe in defunding the police in many cases, but it's a purely negative policy. It's what you're going to take funding away from. Whereas you're talking about, well, let's fund real safety, and let's take safety seriously. We believe that everyone should be safe. But we just don't believe that that is done through militarizing the subway, sending men in with guns in to attack someone who jumps the turnstile or what have you. So let's see. To conclude here, is there anything else you would? Are there any other big issues? We've gone through the core, the sort of economic issues, but what is your? Describe to us a little more your vision for what a New York under a competent, effective, leftist mayor could become.
It could become the city that it was always meant to be, which is a place that working people can flourish, that working people can dream of more than simply getting off the wheel to go to sleep and getting back on the hamster wheel in the morning to go back to work. Because what we have right now is a crisis where the people who've built this city, who sustain this city, are the ones who are being pushed out of this city, all while we are concerned about this imaginary flight of the wealthy from New York City, when it's in fact the working class who are leaving this place that we call home. And what a Mamdani mayorality would look like is spending each and every day figuring out how we could make this city more affordable and how we could bring a shred of dignity back into the working class's life on a 24-hour basis, on and on and on.
Well, Current Affairs is prohibited as a 501c3 nonprofit from offering endorsements, but we wish you the best of luck in your campaign. If people want to support you, what should they do?
They should go to zohrannyc.com, and they should click a link to donate, as well as a link to sign up to volunteer, because the only way that we can build a campaign that's worthy of New Yorkers' hope and New Yorkers' belief is if it's a fully funded campaign. And we are doing incredible work to get there, but we need a lot of help to get to the finish line.
And thanks to New York's amazing campaign finance laws, your money goes a long way.
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you so much, Zohran Mamdani, for joining us on Current Affairs Day.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs Magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs Podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.